Hello, all, and welcome back to another episode of Wrenches, Gadgets, and Hacks, a technology podcast for the curious and creative in the AECO and beyond. It's hard to believe we've already made it to Series 3, second episode. And in this series, it's a little bit different. We have a theme, but the theme is that we don't really have a theme. We just have a lot of really great guests this season. So I called it the Great Guest's Choice or Guest's Choice, the AECO Mavericks Unscripted, which is really what we're here today. Of course, John has agreed to come back again this series to co-host, to keep me in line and to ask the hard questions. I'm the soft questions, he's the hard questions, or maybe the other way around. We'll see how it goes. But that brings us to our wonderful guest, Susan Young. John and I both met her back in the 2023 Built keynote. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But Susan, please introduce yourself. Tell us a little more about you.
Okay, thank you, Carl and John. It was a pleasure to meet you in Dallas at the Built conference during the keynote, and to keep in touch with Carl and John all along the last year or so. I'm all about stories and storytelling, and so I will share my story with you. I didn't talk till I was 4 years old. My parents thought I was deaf. I was born in Brooklyn, and we lived in Brooklyn at the time. So they took me to the doctor, and he said, no, she's not deaf. She's perfectly healthy. She just doesn't need to talk. And they were like, what does that mean? And he said, well, what does she do when she's hungry? We'd go over to the refrigerator and bang on the door, and then food would magically appear. So eventually, of course, I start to talk. And I go to college, and what does a kid like this do? I major in mass communication. And the first week on campus, I stumble on the radio station, and I was just always into radio and into the news and a strong writer. So I got involved with the campus radio station there in Connecticut, and graduated, went back to New Jersey, and for 10 years worked as a on-air radio news reporter and news anchor, interviewed everyone from homeless people to presidents. So I've been a storyteller for 40 years. And also ran Governor Christie Whitman's Office of Radio and Television in Trenton at the state capitol, and was a public relations director for a statewide nonprofit. So fast forward 24 years ago, I started my consulting company because I sat through at all of these different jobs, hundreds of presentations from architects, engineers, and construction folks for zoning and protests and building garbage landfills and incinerators and malls and everything, bridges. And I saw so many painful presentations, a few powerful ones, but most were painful. And I decided to open up my communications consulting company to help architects, engineers, and construction to communicate more effectively, to not be packing those PowerPoint slides with voluminous amounts of information and look at their shoes when they're talking and not have eye contact and all of that. Now, of course, with social media. So these days, what I do is I coach and teach online and keynote in person and do webinars on how to become a confident communicator so that you can have more trust, impacting clients. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
It sounds like a great story, and you're definitely hit the bullseye talking about our industry and the AEC or the AECO. Bring those owners involved. They pay the bills, so we got to get them involved as well to talk about this and to get people in place, which is why I think you're a great fit for what we're doing here at Wrenches, Gadgets, and Hacks. But it's not just about the technology. And I was just recently at the Built event in Australia, in Melbourne, or Melbourne, as I was told to pronounce it. And one of the things we talked about was the idea that we're always seen as this industry that's just behind agriculture, that's so far behind in technology and changing. And while that's true, the technology part isn't that true anymore. We've started to find new technologies. We have a ton of different startups. We're really going that. But what I think we are lagging behind, as you mentioned, Susan, is the idea of how do we impart the knowledge, whether it's with dealing with our employees or hiring new people or just training on that content. For years, I was a trainer, and a lot of times you'd get people that just aren't willing to understand the way you're communicating something. So being able to communicate better and to be able to change your style of communication based on the room you're in front of, I think is something we could all do a little better with in our industry for sure.
Yeah, it's interesting because I work with so many large and small firms. The leaders will say to me, Oh, I was just dusting off. We're moving our office. We're just dusting off the bookshelves and packing things up. And the last training I had was in 2019. And I'm like, and you're training them? Your skills are so outdated. And it's even if it's 6 months ago. And the approach that I use that really differentiates, I think being a new, people would say, why would a news reporter, why should we listen to a news reporter? What do you know about renderings and surveys and digital twins and all that? It's about telling stories and engaging presentations. It's about curiosity, which you mentioned in the introduction there. It's about deep listening, not active listening, but deep listening. Knowing how to ask good questions. Quality questions bring quality information. How to articulate in what I call sound bites. Just 8 words or less. Sum it up. What's your point? What's the bottom line? Why is this relevant to me? Who cares? And when you mix that with brain science and the neurolinguistic programming that I've learned and how to connect with people and our experiences and our behavior, our internal communication, that's the neat little blend there that nobody else uses this perspective. And they're tools for life. It's not, if you remember Facebook, they said, this is just a fad. Social media is going to go away. No, not quite. Human storytelling and human communication, what I call the human factor, human to human, is not going out of style anytime soon.
Definitely. And so one thing I caught on when you were doing your introduction too is you said that you sat through very many painful presentations, and that was what made you think, hey, we got to make this better. That's definitely something that I think we've all experienced. So I find it really interesting. That's one of the things that you're like, wait a minute, there's an opportunity for improvement here, whether you're talking about whatever technology or project. It boils down to effectively telling the story of that thing. And if you're stuttering through and mumbling and turning around, loads of bullets on the PowerPoint, everything, it's definitely one of those things. I had a public communication class that I was in, a public speaking class. And I had a presentation once, and then I've watched a few people's presentations and how they struggled through it. And I actually redid my whole presentation when I was in school, targeting a lot of the topics that I noticed while people were talking. So things like projectors not working, things like the slides aren't on their computer loaded correctly. And I made my presentation all about how to prepare for those things just because I had a similar experience in that public speaking class, which I thought was interesting. Yeah, it was really fun to change my whole presentation last minute, but yeah, I made points like bands don't borrow instruments. They bring their own instruments with them when they perform a show. Why would you rely on other people's things? And I think a lot of times we tend to be a little bit lazy in the AEC industry when it comes to actually presenting and sharing things and like teaching. We feel like that's like the least important, I think, sometimes because they just care about the project or whatever. So it is really interesting.
Yeah, I think that you really did nail it, John, is that we have so much data, but we need to connect first as human beings. That's the emotional part of storytelling. And I know that AEC is left brain, is the analytical, scientific, logical, but we need to marry the right brain and the left brain so that we do hit the emotions, because nobody was born an engineer or an architect or a BIM developer or whatever. We were born little baby humans. And so we're people first. And when we're able to connect first as human beings and not depend on the technology, because if the technology craps out, the PowerPoint slides don't work or the projector blows up, you're basically, they're buying you. You are the message. You are the message. And they didn't come there to see your PowerPoint deck. No, that's not what it's about.
Definitely. Carl just did a conference in the spring, right, Carl, where you didn't have any technology and you were talking about AI. You had to give a talk on AI without a projector or anything.
Right. Yeah.
That was a little bit different. I'll give you credit for remembering that, because it was the first conference I'd been to where it was the unconference with Phil Reed. But yeah, I did a session on AI and we had no technology at all. But it was exactly the conversation. At that point, it was a round table. So I got help from everyone else in the room. And I was lucky enough that my first question is, what's AI to you? Keeping it short, less than 8 words. And then the rest of the audience spent an hour doing my presentation for me. If I could do that every time, that would be gold.
Love it. Yeah. And Phil's terrific. Yeah. Met him. We moved to Myrtle Beach earlier this year. And so he's nearby. So we connected for lunch a couple of months ago. And
Cool.
yeah, he was talking about the unconference and just awesome people in this industry and being able to share our expertise and articulate the message. People, like back to what John said, are so afraid of, I'm afraid of public speaking, or I have this fear, or I'm not good at it, or I'm introverted, I'm shy, whatever it is. And it's, you know what, we convince ourselves, again, with the brain thing going here, we brainwash ourselves into that. But the bottom line here is that people are born with two innate fears: the fear of falling and the fear of loud noises. That's it. We develop the fear of public speaking. So if you learned it, I teach you how to unlearn it.
Right.
And everybody, look, there's very smart, bright, educated people in AEC. There's no question. And we need to know that you can learn these communication skills too. That nobody learned this in school. You might have had, like John mentioned, a public speaking class or something like that. But it's really important now, because the bottom line is that today, everyone is in marketing. And most people
Very
didn't
true.
sign up for it, but we're here.
Yeah.
And the seller doers, the tech people, you've got to learn it. You've got to know how to introduce yourself in the 30-second elevator pitch, and the sound bites, and how to read the room and body language, and how to, ask the right questions and not copy and paste the templates for the proposal from last year and then say, I wonder who's going to be in the room. You don't even know your audience. It's what the heck's going on there, So there's a lot of that going on too that, that we address.
So you brought a good point there about the understanding and the two fears, and then we put all the rest of this fears on us as we grow, like the fear of speaking. Now, I've spoke a couple times, as John knows, and even to this day, no matter what I'm doing or where I'm speaking, I always have that sort of nerves. And I always tell other speakers that I'm talking to that it's good to be nervous, because if you don't have that nerves, it means you don't care. And if you don't care, the session's not going to go well. At least that's how I phrase it. My thought to you, Susan, is in that scenario, it's good to be nervous. It's good to have that sort of healthy fear, the respect of the session that you're doing. But how do you get past the actual, I'm not going to get on stage because I don't think I'll do good. Whatever that fear comes from. But to get past that healthy fear where you respect what you're doing, but you still put in the time to get it right.
I will say this, and I've done many podcasts, and to me, it's fun because it's like radio. So it just brings me back to my day. But in all honesty, all transparency, no BS here, I was nervous coming on here. I was like 20 minutes ago, before we started, I was like, I think my hands are a little shaky. I'm like, I know, Carl, I know, John, I've done these, I talk about this for 40 years. What the heck? I think to take the pressure off, what we really have to do is to appreciate that we are perfectly imperfect, and that you have to practice and go up there. And if you go to a presentation or a meeting and maybe you're the guest speaker, go somewhere where nobody knows you, and so you can practice, and you're not going to be worried like, oh my gosh, so-and-so is here, or I made a bad impression. You're going to screw up. It's the bottom line. But when you try to be somebody who you're not, you're always going to mess up, because when you are yourself, you can't trip yourself up. When you're trying to be somebody else, you're always going to make a mistake. You never would have said that. I should have said it this way or that way. And it's too much pressure. If you see some of the big names like Gary Vaynerchuk, right? You see him, he'll do a video and for years. And I do the same now too. You make a mistake, you keep going. It's like radio. You don't bring it oh my gosh, I mispronounced his name. You just plow right through. It does, because nobody is perfect, and people don't want to do business with people who seem perfect, because we always are going to fall short. And so it just takes the pressure off. Just be you.
Absolutely. I definitely agree with that. And I would say when it comes to like technical presentations too, a lot of times like in our industry, we're doing things where we're showing things live on the computer, and computers never behave, right? Showing those mistakes, I used to get really hung up on it and like frustrated. And after my presentation was done, I'd be like, oh man, I messed up and I didn't do this right. And I got caught up for 5 minutes. But then I got feedback I appreciated you working through that for 5 minutes and talking out loud while figuring it out. That really helped me relate. So definitely when you just be yourself, people in the audience will see themselves in you. And it's just so powerful for people to think that way. I lean on the side of like I like in-person presentations more because I feel like it's easier to see that connection happen when you are like working through something. And we might get into this in a little bit, but when it comes to virtual versus in person, I find that it's a little bit harder to navigate those things. And I personally still struggle doing virtual presentations, even though I feel pretty darn comfortable doing ones in person. It's just, it feels different to me. So I'd be curious, like, what your thoughts are working with clients when it comes to working in a virtual aspect or in presentations that are in person too.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought that up because what I have found, and if somebody would have told me 24 years ago that I'd be doing this, I would have laughed in their face. I'm like, oh, that's not me. I couldn't go on stage and talk. I'm doing a keynote with 200 people in a few weeks in Colorado. My sisters are both like, what? Who are you talking to? And they're listening. I'm like, yeah, I don't know. Because I worked in radio. And so it's easy. It's just like the virtual, what you just explained, John, that nobody's looking back at you. And so it's like when you go on stage and there is a live audience, it's like doing theater in acting versus being in a studio. And so you know when people laugh, you hear somebody sneeze, you see when they're glued to you and when they're mesmerized and when they're hanging on every single word. And so I had to learn gestures and how I move and behave because all I needed in radio was I'm sitting in a news booth, which was, I'm going to date myself now, the size of a phone booth, like a pantry. Okay, like a pantry. There were tape decks, headphones, microphone. Nobody was looking back at me. I was talking to 500,000 people in the New Jersey, New York media market, which is the most competitive in the country. But it was all my voice. All I had to say was it was 45 degrees and sunny here in Morristown, shadow traffic, sponsored by blah, blah, blah. I didn't need to use my hands and be aware of the space and all that. And so I needed to learn that. And it didn't come easy to me. It just took practice. And that's what I teach now. But I think the most important communication that we have is the communication we have in our heads. It's the internal communication. I can do this, or I'm stuck. I don't know how. It's what my coach says is the illusion of confusion. The illusion of confusion. You're not stuck. Yeah. Nobody's stuck. This is AEC is, like I say, really smart. They know how to build a room. They just don't know how to read the room. And that's where I come in.
That should be on a t-shirt.
Cool. It's on my website.
Speaking of your website, we've been talking quite a bit about your presentation because that's where John and I spend a lot of time, and a lot of people in the AECO industry do. But you help people, you coach people through not only speaking, but communication in general. So when we're outside of that realm, there's so many other ways that we need to communicate when we're inside of the AEC industry. What are some of the other ways that you can help people down that path with communicating besides just getting on a stage and public speaking?
Yeah, it is one thing to say that most people who are at those trade shows or expos or conferences, they are so smart and they're hiding behind the booth on the trade floor, giving away candy and tickets or whatever, when they should be teaching a workshop. The way to get out there is how to make small talk at networking events, how to use icebreakers, how to break into a conversation, and even though you're nervous and anxiety riddled and all of that, how to introduce yourself, how to move the conversation and forward and make people curious. Curiosity is my big thing, is that I teach people how to develop that sense of coming at things from a different perspective and being curious. Because I was learned early on in radio was to, like I said, you ask good questions, you get good information. It's knowing how to engage people in those conversations, whether it's at a luncheon or a conference or a workshop. Storytelling, of course, is how do you connect? I mean, just paying attention to what's around you. Take those earbuds out and get out of your own head and listen to the conversations. You don't even just be a little ninja. You don't have to participate or break in and start chiming in and chattering with people, but you're in the elevator. Listen to what people are saying. Listen to and write down some ideas for content, for posts, for videos, for things that people are concerned about, for market research. It's so important. And to keep your finger on the pulse of the twists, turns, and trends in the industry. People are like, I'm so busy. I don't have time to. I'm like, really? So you were watching The Bachelor, and then what happened? And I tell my son, he's now 29, I say, everyone's busy, busy. I said, busy doing what? You couldn't find 5 minutes to read that newsletter to prepare for that presentation and know that the owner is a, Seattle Seahawks fan or went to the same school that you went to? Shame on you. That's it.
Definitely. I think that's a really interesting point you made, the comment on the earbuds. I think like generally, especially in the last 4 years, people generally are more disconnected. They're working at home perhaps, but even when we're out at things, most people are keeping to themselves. And for conferences too, it was just like being a little more distant. Like we didn't have as many opportunities for a few years at conferences for people to have those bump into each other conversations. So I think that's one thing just to reiterate to people is listen to what's going on around you and create whatever fills those needs. I think that's a really powerful thing for people. Stop doing this on the phone just the whole time, scrolling and scrolling and scrolling.
Yeah. And then people will come back and say, oh, that conference, we didn't get any leads. It's because your nose was in your phone the whole time. You didn't talk to anybody. You didn't look at anybody. Yes. And then they say, oh, the conference sucked. It was just a waste of time. We just went there. And people will say to me, wow, I'm going to networking events now and I'm generating leads and referrals.
For sure.
Just because I'm showing up in a whole different way. Mm-hmm. And it's just the energy and the mindset. And when that converges, it's magic.
Definitely. And thinking about that too, I've actually gotten, not in arguments, discussions with people because we'll be at conferences and they want to keep on leaving where the conference is to go do other things. And that's all fine depending where you're at. So if it's a really cool city and you want to see the sights, we went to one a year ago in Chicago. I'd never been to Chicago. So we had some time for exploring, but sometimes people interpret that as we're always going to leave and never hang out in the exhibit hall, around the conference rooms or anything. And for me, I'm like, that's where a lot of the great stuff happens. We'll explore also, but let's not leave during this 2-3 hour block of networking events and classes. And I think that's one thing that like people get caught up in as well, is not taking advantage of that stuff that's sitting right in front of you as well. I haven't been to a conference in a bit, but that was always one thing that I'm always like telling people about. The food sucks in this exhibit hall. I'm like, yeah, I know, but everyone's in here. Like we can eat later.
And that's a great point because it is the networking. Going back to Phil's conference, the acoustic, the idea that it was the networking, the part around all the sessions and all the content that really made it different. And we all been through all those years where everything was virtual, and you can copy a lot of things virtually, but the networking is never the same. And just being there, like Susan said, being the fly in the wall and hearing things and getting into conversation, and then finding out that you guys have something in common. And as you say, you may not get that lead, but you have that something in common. So now there's a callback to that person. 2 years, 6 months down the road, different role, different position, you have that callback. So you have a reason to take that information and make that lead, make that connection for that. So it's not always about the here and now. It's about being, as John said, being present there at the moment, but then you get the information that comes out down the road. So sometimes it seems like more of a long game, but virtually that doesn't happen. When you're in person and you have those conversations, that's where it really changes. And that's where having the ability to communicate brings that all back around.
Yeah, I think it's really about being able to articulate and be memorable and so you resonate with other people so they keep you in mind and they remember you. You're not just another face in the expo hall of 400 people, but they remember that conversation that you had about the Seattle Seahawks or something that brought you together emotionally, that connected you, and you build that rapport. And it's happened to me. Somebody called me 3 years after I spoke at a Chamber of Commerce breakfast. 3 years. He said, this is Bill. This was back in New Jersey. He says, this is Bill. I heard you speak at the Middlesex County Chamber of Commerce breakfast. And I'm thinking, when was that? Like, he says, I've had your card on my desk for 3 years. I'm like, okay. So we met for lunch and I recognized him and then it all made sense and came together, but I had no idea who I was talking to. And when we met, I wound up landing this contract with him and his firm for 5 years as a consultant. So cool. It was like, people come up to me afterwards and say, let's have a meeting, or it could take 3 years. You don't know. But you put yourself out there, because here's what I have found. A cold keyboard will never replace a warm handshake. We could say hybrid. We could say it's a pandemic. Yeah. We could say Gen Z didn't learn this. And I get it. I totally get it. But we have to push ourselves to go out there, even when it's hard, to be seen and not hide behind our keyboards and our tech.
Definitely. That's super true and very powerful. That's, you always remember those people who look you in the eyes and they say, hello, I'm so, and it's just like that. One of those people is one of our friends. It's Marcelo, who does presentations at the conferences we go to. And he does that. He stands at the door and shakes every person who comes into his classes hand. I learned that from him. I would do that when it's in person as well. And he actually had a quote that I really liked in one of his presentations that reminds me of what you were saying too. It's from Maya Angelou. I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And he had that on one of his presentations, and that's always stuck with me, is people remember how you made them feel. And 3 years later, reaching out to you is pretty awesome. That seed was definitely planted, which is very cool.
And I love that Maya Angelou quote too.
So we are getting close to the allotted half-hour time slot. So I have 2 questions left for you, Susan. So the big question at the end, I'll leave for the end. But before we get to that, I do know that you have something very exciting coming up, as talking about the idea of getting people in place, and those of us from the AEC to learning. Could you just talk just a little bit about your new top-tier communicator training that's coming out before I ask you for your hack?
Sure. Yeah, our top tier communicator is 3 days of online training for AEC, so that we cover everything that we just talked about here in the last 30 minutes or so. It's about how to train your brain for confidence and how to become more confident, more engaging, how to network and make small talk, and curiosity and storytelling, and how to be self-assured so that you can attract more impact and clients and referrals and win pursuits. It's about growing your career and growing your firm. Top tier communicator starts on November 12th. It's 3 full days. We used to teach this in 3 months. Everyone's busy. So 3 days, dig in, and you can really kick off with a dynamite 2025. Because look, we're 25 years almost into the new century, and AEC is still decades behind, and there's no reason for it. There's no reason to procrastinate or to say, oh, my training was in 2019. Okay, that's funny, but you're losing millions of dollars a month on lost bids and productivity and proposals and people that don't belong in client-centric meetings. And that's what top tier communicator is all about. 3 days starting November 12th, and you earn CEUs. You get the top tier communicator badge so that you post it online. People will see it. Your clients will see they've had rigorous communication and business development skills. You're not going to be wasting their time. You're not going to be droning on and rambling and confusing and missing, key points. You're going to nail it, and you're going to have long-lasting, deeper relationships.
Awesome. That sounds exciting. There will definitely be a link somewhere down here to get to that. It does sound really exciting.
Yeah, and by the way, you know what? It's also just one quick thing. It's for firms and individuals. The deal is it's $497. It's like a no-brainer. Oh, we don't have the budget. We don't have the time. I thought I was busy. I might have taken something like this. No, you haven't taken anything like this, okay? This is brain science, communication, confidence, curiosity, and storytelling.
How many wasted hours is that even? When I worked at an architecture firm, we'd always have those conversations, and I'm like, the time we stood here talking about me taking this darn course costs that much. Can we just make this happen? Yeah, very cool. It sounds awesome.
Yeah, it's for action takers. That's how I'm Jersey. It's like, you're doing it or you're not.
Absolutely.
Here it is.
So that does bring us to the final question of all of our episodes, and that's, what's your hack for, I could say for this episode, what's your hack for communication?
It's take back the power of your mind. We all have our brains and we all have our voices. And so when you take back the power and stop listening to that negative self-talk, and doubting yourself, and you brainwash yourself in a new way of being more empowered and being unstoppable and feeling confident with a dose of humility, so you're not arrogant or pushy or obnoxious or anything. But when you hit that nice sweet spot in the middle, that's where the magic is. And so the hack is, how do you notice and develop that self-awareness so that you can focus your attention on being uplifting and making a bigger impact, instead of going in saying, I'm shy, I'm reserved, I don't know what I'm talking about, I didn't have time. People need your gifts. You have to share them.
Great.
Very
Any final thoughts, John, before we sign off?
No, this is awesome. I really appreciate you taking the time. I got a lot out of it, and yeah, just the keynote was great, and it was great chatting with you a little more one-on-one. Very awesome, and I look forward to this one getting out there for everyone to hear. I think it's very important. We all like to geek out about technology, but being able to communicate is so key, and I think what you're doing is awesome for everyone. So thank you for that.
I appreciate that. Thank you, John, and thank you, Carl.
And I couldn't agree more. And with that, we will sign off. So thank you for joining us for another episode of Wrenches, Gadgets, and Hacks, where we explore the tools, the technologies, and the communication, time-saving hacks to shape our future. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to subscribe somewhere down here, and stay tuned for more insights into the exciting world of AECO and technology. Until next time, keep building, innovating, and exploring the possibilities.